it's hard to define Satanism in one short rule. This is too wide and complicated to be covered in a small formula. There are many layers, myths, and misunderstandings behind it. It is also very badly known and is associated with black masses, sacrifices of people or animals, the conclusion of a pact with the forces of darkness, or night-long orgies. This is, of course, mostly the imagination of writers and Hollywood, because Satanism itself sometimes refers only by name to Satan. The cult of the devil is found in theists of theistic Satanism, who describe their beliefs as a religion, but also a philosophy. We also have the atheist movement and contemporary Satanists closer to this group. Their followers do not worship the gods, and Satan is only a certain symbol of breaking the Christian commandments and prohibitions that Satanists believe limit human nature. Interestingly, in the United States, followers of the Church of Satan are increasingly becoming human rights defenders, fighting for equality and access to abortion, or attacking homophobic and racist organizations. It must be remembered, however, that this bad reputation did not come from nowhere. First, the very form of Satan, the absolute, dominant evil, is sufficient for those who take it as their symbol to become a carrier of negative associations for us. Moreover, in the history of mankind, there have been many characters who, with the devil in their mouths, have done terrible things. The sacrifice, the destruction of cemeteries and temples, mostly Christian, the creation of sex. Behind all this often stood Satanists, or at least people who described themselves as such followers. Among them was one of the most terrifying serial killers in the United States. The man who reminded his victims of a real demon. He emerged from the darkness and carried with him pain and suffering. He was a night hunt. In Los Angeles, every summer is extremely hot. The heat from the sky causes people to open windows, lift the balcony doors, or cool on the benches in search of even a little air. They are separated from the world only by mosquitoes, which, although they protect against unwanted insects, no longer protect against another human being. On June 28, 1984, a mysterious man was circling between the houses, watching them closely. He felt a growing anger, combined with an enormous need to hurt someone. Earlier he had already broken into houses, from which he took valuables and went out completely unnoticed. This time, however, he wanted the inhabitants not only to see it but also to remember it. He got to Chapman Street, stopped the car there, and stayed in it for a while. When he made sure that no one was watching him, he stepped out of the vehicle and headed toward the house, which was to become his new target. It was dark, and the only light was the street lanterns flashing on the backdrop of the black sky. The man took a step towards the house where 79-year-old Jenny Winkle lived. The woman lived in the building alone. Sometimes her sons visited her. A stranger immediately noticed that one of the windows had been folded. Only a mosquito separated him from the entrance. To get rid of her, the robber had to take off his gloves. After a moment, the obstacle was already on the ground, and the man pulled up and slipped inside. He froze for a moment in immobility to get his eyes accustomed to the darkness and ensure that the householder or households were asleep. When he didn't hear anything, he went deep into the house. He immediately headed to the bedroom, where Jenny was lying unconscious. Before he approached her, he also checked if the woman was sure to be alone. He also searched the cabinets in the hope of finding, for example, valuable jewelry. But after a while, it came to him that he was getting rich in this house. The old lady had nothing to take or sell. He was angry and decided to turn his anger on an innocent woman. He picked up a big, sharp knife, approached Jenny and, without long thinking, put a blade in her chest. The stinging pain pulled the woman out of her sleep. She started screaming, but that only made the attacker even more excited. So he began to bite her without repentance until he finally ended her life with a deep and strong cut in her throat. It was so wide that it almost cut off her head. After the murder, Jenny stayed at her house for about an hour, after which he escaped the building, got into the car, and played a song from his favorite band. Listening to the AC/DC, the attacker repeated in his mind that what he had done a moment earlier was a sacrifice to Satan. Jenny's body was found a few hours later by her son, Jack. As he approached the house, he noticed that there was no mosquito on the window. Besides, the door was overturned. The man entered the living room, which was in total mess. He went into the bedroom and there, under the blanket, found his mother. She was whole in blood, just like the walls of the room. Jack ran out of the house screaming that Jenny had been murdered. The police arrived after a few minutes. It was only when we looked at the bodies that we could see the extent of the injuries that the perpetrator inflicted on the woman. The throat was cut almost from ear to ear. The wounds also covered the chest, arm, leg, and arms, suggesting that she was trying to defend herself. The old lady was also sexually abused. The shirt was pulled up, and the intimate places were mutilated. However, no traces were found in the house that would help to identify the perpetrator of this horrible crime. With another attack, the perpetrator waited until March 1985. He managed to buy a weapon during this time, which gave him the possibilities to terrorize people. On March 17th, he drove a stolen car to Monterey Park. There he saw Marie Hernandez, a 22-year-old woman who had just returned from a meeting with her boyfriend. The man followed her. He followed her until she parked in front of the house. The girl rented the apartment with De La Kazaki, her friend. As soon as she got into the garage and got out of the car, the assailant was already heading towards her. Unconscious of the danger, Maria stood by the switch with which she wanted to leave the garage door, but the man had time to slide inside. The door knocked on his head with the AC/DC inscription, which fell to the ground. However, he ignored it and lifted up his weapon. At the same time, the girl intuitively turned and noticed a stranger targeting her. She used to scream for him not to do that. She reflected her hands, and the attacker fired at her face, and then something unlikely happened. In the hand that Hernandez held, there were keys, and it was in them that the bullet struck, without causing more harm to the girl. Mary fell to the ground, and although she was conscious, she began to pretend dead. The man, convinced that he had committed another murder, entered the apartment. He was in the dining room connected to the kitchen. He noticed a specimen there, which, when he saw the intruder, immediately hid behind the cabinets. She hoped he'd have seen her, but she was wrong. The assailant knew where she was hiding and waited in absolute silence for the girl to bend. As soon as she lifted her head, he shot her straight in the forehead. He waited a few seconds, then he left the building, and then he was completely surprised. Mary was standing in front of the house. He picked up his gun to shoot her again, but then the girl yelled, "Please, no, you killed me once, don't do it a second time." And here again, something unexpected happened, because the attacker didn't shoot. Still aiming at Hernandez, he began to retreat until he finally disappeared in the distance. Mary immediately called the police for the attacker. However, this was not the end. Then, as soon as he got into the car, he took the highway to San Bernardino. Then he saw Tsai also called Veronica, so he started following her. The woman quickly realized that she was being followed. So she decided to get off the road, pretending to be parking. When the man passed by her, she thought that now she would follow him and find out who he was and why he was interested in her. She followed him until they both had to stop at the red light. Then the man noticed the woman, got out of the car, and went in her direction. When he was close, she began to ask why he was following her. The stranger denied everything, but Veronica didn't let go. She accused him of lying and announced she'd call the police. Hearing the threat, the man fell in anger. He approached the woman and tried to pull her out through the open window. When he failed, he got into the car from the passenger side, took out the gun and fired. The wounded Veronica tried to escape, but then another bullet hit her. She didn't survive. The attacker got into his vehicle and left. Later, he abandoned the car on the first side street he found himself in. De La Kazaki was killed by Jill Carrillo. As it turned out, he knew Marie personally. Therefore, the arrest of the perpetrator became a matter of honor for him. The officer went to the hospital where Hernandez was. She told him everything in detail, but she admitted directly She had no idea who the attacker was. She hadn't seen him before, and she didn't know why he chose her as the target. At that time, Carrillo had no idea that the answer to the latter question would sound cruelly trivial. Because yes, the man who attacked was choosing completely random people, and he was supposed to prove it soon. Officers quickly linked the murder of Veronica and Kazaki, so a real legend of the murder department was involved in the investigation. Franca Salerno was in charge of solving the case of the Hilsikers who in the years 77 to 79 kidnapped, tortured, and killed young women. So if anyone was to help catch this next killer, it would be Salerno, called in the environment a bulldog. Meanwhile, on March 26th, the killer stole another car and headed toward the town of Whittier, full of luxury hotels and pools. He hoped that in such a rich neighborhood he would find a house from which he would be able to take out a lot of valuable items. It was midnight when he arrived in front of the house of Vincent and Maxim Zazarov. He approached the window and saw a man sleeping on the couch. The woman, in turn, was in bed, also in a dream. The killer looked around and saw a small window covered with mosquitoes which gave him a chance to get inside. He moved the barrel that stood nearby, stepped on it, and removed the security. He quickly found himself in the building. He went to Vincent first. When he was close, he took out his gun and shot the man in the head. The noise woke up Maxime before she could react. In her room stood already a stranger. The woman started screaming, but then the man hit her in the face. He told her to shut up. Maxim, however, resisted, which only increased his anger. He hated it when women protested. He wanted them to beg for mercy and submit to him, so he threw himself on Mrs. Caesar and began to beat without repentance, repeating that she should not look at him. After a moment, he turned her on her stomach, tied her hands, disconnected her phones, and left her shrunk. He was convinced that there was money or valuable jewelry in the house, so he started checking all the cabinets in turn. Meanwhile, Maxine managed to loosen her ties a little so that she could quietly get off the bed. She reached for a hidden gun nearby. When the man turned, he saw a raft pointing towards him. The woman pressed the trigger, but nothing happened. My husband didn't load his gun. The attacker went crazy, pulled out his gun, and started shooting at the victim, and when she fell, he jumped toward her and beat her. He left Maxim for a moment, ran into the kitchen, took out the knife, then went back to the bedroom, struck the woman with a blade, and cut off her reverse cross on her left chest. He also opened her eyes, hiding them in a stolen box. He still tried to have sex with the dead woman, but he couldn't get in. So he took his prey and disappeared, leaving behind a macabre sight. The body section revealed that Mr. Zazara's body contained a .22 caliber revolver missile. The same one was used by the perpetrator, killing the Cossacks and her. When Jill Carrillo took over the reports of all these cases, he came up with a theory that found no allies among the officers. He believed that there was one person behind all these crimes and that the police were dealing with a serial killer. The only person who supported this version was Frank Salerno. Although he was slightly more skeptical than Jill, he also did not rule out the possibility that all these cases could be interrelated. But it's not the only thing that has caused the investigators to worry. They discovered that there was a series of kidnappings of minors at the beginning of the year. Someone took the children out of their own beds, kidnapped them, harassed them, and then abandoned them or let them escape. One of the victims was 6-year-old Anastasia Kronas. That night, a stranger opened the window of her bedroom and took her while she was sleeping deeply. Then he got into his car and left, Anastasia mentioned. I don't know how long we've been driving or what kind of car. All I remember is that at one point he looked at me and told me to open the drawer. There was a gun inside. He closed the drawer, saying, "It's like something." Then it started. He told me to look at him, touch him, and so on. When we arrived, I remembered the fence and the dogs. He told me to go into the bag tied to the slider and he said, "Be quiet, be here, don't stand, do what I tell you." There was a sofa in the room we went through. It was pretty dark and cloudy. The windows were covered with curtains. There was a lot of food packaging everywhere, not like I do at home. Madonna's songs were flying all the time. I remember saying, "Stand, stop, it hurts. Why are you doing that?" When I wanted to suck, he interrupted, took me, and planted me in the sink. He didn't do anything for a while, and then he took me again. Then I said he wanted me to suck and he stopped every time, even though he said, "Okay, but I know you're shooting." He looked at me like he regretted what he did to me, but he didn't mean to stop. He put me in the bag again and we left that house. The man took the girl to the gas station and left her there. There were at least a few such stories. And most importantly, the children's drawings of the perpetrator coincided with what Maria Hernandez said. Everyone was talking about a man with black eyes, who was extremely skinny and smelled ugly. Carrillo and Salerno began to suspect that there was one person behind the kidnappings and murders. It was a brave theory because it meant that the police were dealing with an absolute madman, completely unstandard. Not only did he commit murders that seemed to have no scheme to be attributed to a serial killer, but he also committed extremely different crimes. These were both burglary, theft, kidnapping of children, murder and mutilation of victims. And they were different in sex and age. Usually, serial killers choose a specific group that becomes their target. For example, Ted Bundy murdered young, attractive students, even though a 12-year-old girl was on his bloody list. Jeffrey Dahmer attracted young men, and Albert Fish kidnapped children, who he later tortured, and some even ate. Each of them, however, had its own modus operandi, that is, a distinctive and unique way of acting and behaving. In the case of the psychopath who was hunted by Carrillo and Salerno, there was no such scheme. On May 14th, the killer went hunting again. With another stolen vehicle, he reached Monterey Park, where he killed Veronica. The house of William and Lillian Doy came into his eyes. The marriage was peaceful, though not without problems in life. The woman suffered an outbreak, which made her disabled. Nevertheless, the couple did not lose their spirit and was extremely liked by the neighbors. The building was not well secured. The assailant got inside without any trouble. First, he entered Mrs. Doy's bedroom, where he saw a wheelchair by the bed. This assured him that he was dealing with completely defenseless households. He walked into William's room, took out his gun, and unlocked it. A characteristic click awoke the man who, in a fraction of a second, shuddered and grabbed the pistol that he had in his nightclub. Despite his quick reaction, he was unable to defend himself from the intruder, who fired a direct shot into the victim's face. But that wasn't enough for him. He approached William, threw him off his bed, and started digging. Overwhelmed with aggression, he went into Lillian's room. The woman didn't sleep anymore. The noise coming from her husband's bedroom completely woke her up. The man ran toward her and struck her in the face with all his strength. Later, he put a rope on her thumbs, and he went through the house himself. He took everything he thought was valuable. He went back to Mrs. D.Y., kissed her, and ran away. Although it's hard to believe, William was still alive. He regained consciousness and, with his remaining forces, ran into the phone to call for help. The police immediately arrived at the scene. The man was taken to the hospital, but he died there a dozen minutes later. This time, the perpetrator left a clue at the crime scene. A shoe footprint was found on the ground just outside the building. His mark was quickly established. It was via a sports shoe company. As it turns out later, the same fingerprint was also in other places where the killer appeared. On May 29th, the man went to Monrovia, California. He arrived at the house of Mabel Bell and her handicapped sister Florence Land. The women were 83 and 80 years old. Besides, they weren't rich, which the intruder understood just after he crossed the threshold of the house. The man was angry, but he didn't claim to himself that he had made the wrong choice. Absolutely absurdly, he directed his anger toward the housewives. He went into the kitchen, grabbed the hammer he found there, and went to the Florence bedroom. He approached the old lady and struck her in the head with all his strength. The skull quickly broke under the pressure of a heavy shoulder. The assailant ripped the electrical cord off the watch and tied the woman's hands. Pulling out the cable, he pressed his shoe on that watch, leaving a clearly bloody mark on it. After the attack on Florence, the man entered her sister's bedroom. She was also hit with a hammer in the head, but the woman did not lose consciousness. She started screaming about it. The attacker tried to silence her, threatening to kill her. He also managed money. When he didn't get what he wanted, he hit the old lady again. Then, like the woman's sister, he pulled the cable from the clock and hit the victim with electricity with its tip. On her left thigh, and also on the wall above her bed, he drew the pentagrams with lipstick. In this way, he gave a clear signal to the whole world that these crimes were a sacrifice to Satan. Before he left the house, he went back to Florence and her. He also left a symbol in her bedroom. Both old women were found 2 days later. They were still alive, but they were in a coma. Their condition was critical. They had cranial cracks so severe that they could see a brain. The investigators had a huge problem with this case. On the one hand, many details matched previously discovered crimes, but on the other hand, there were subjects that did not completely match each other. For example, this time the perpetrator used a hammer, not a firearm or a knife. In addition, satanic symbols appeared for the first time. But Carrillo had the feeling that the same murderer was hiding behind the macabre. Before the investigators found the elderly, the man had another attack. He got to Burbank, which is 19 kilometers from downtown Los Angeles. He got in possession of Carol Kyle, a 42-year-old woman who lived with her son and daughter. And this time, without much trouble, the intruder got inside. He took the gun with him, and a moment later he woke up Carol asleep, turning her head. He asked her if there was anyone else in the house besides her. She said it was an 11-year-old son. He walked with her into the boys' room and bound them there. He began to loot the premises in search of valuable items. After a while, he took Carol to her bedroom, stabbed her, and brutally her. The woman didn't protest. She hoped that if she obeyed all the orders, the attacker would get what he came for and disappear without hurting her child. After the man asked Carol which way she should go to get to the highway. She answered him and asked him to throw some clothes on her. She didn't want her son to see her naked. The assailant gave her the nightshirt and left. Evil, a hunter woman crime. The beginning of June caused the killer a lot of trouble. As usual, he went hunting. He arrived at Pico Rivera, where John Rodriguez lived. The man had no idea that he had chosen the home of the deputy sheriff of Los Angeles as his next target. The cop lived with Lorraine's wife and children and always slept with a gun in his hand. That hot night, his vigilance, and especially that of his wife, saved their lives. The woman later, John slept in the bedroom, and I slept on the couch in the living room. I was awakened by a terrible noise. I yelled at my husband nervously. I was sure he would wake the kids. But I immediately felt it wasn't him. A grave silence answered me. I was afraid. Terrible fear. I didn't know if there was something in the house or if it happened on the threshold, but something was there. And I was paralyzed by fear. John, alerted by his wife, went out. Meanwhile, Lorraine noticed that one of the windows was open. In front of the house, the cop saw a clear footprint of the shoe. He covered it with a box so it'd be destroyed and called his colleagues in. Carrillo also came there. When he saw the secure footprint of the shoe, he realized that he was dealing with the killer he was looking for. For it was the same sign he saw in the previous houses. After this unsuccessful attempt, the killer took a break. It was activated in early July. He arrived in Arcadia near Los Angeles. He chose the house of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon as his destination. He quickly disassembled the mosquito and weighed the window. He slipped inside like a snake, completely silent. The old lady was asleep when a white vase fell on her head. When she woke up and started screaming, a man hit her in the face, depriving her of consciousness. Then he went to the kitchen and took the knife. He went back to Mary and put the blade in her neck. The next strikes had already fallen to the blind. After the victim showed no signs of life, he abandoned her, robbed the house, and left. During this time, the laboratory technician was given an extremely important task. He had to find out if the shoes that the perpetrator was wearing could give any clue as to his identity. To do this, he boarded an airplane and flew to Portland, Oregon. The shoe designer reveal was based there. On the basis of castings carried out at the crime scene, it was established that the perpetrator was wearing a shoe size 45. It is also assumed that they dress in black to fit in the background, and so the shoes must not be thrown into the eye, so the best color is black. It turned out that only 1,354 pairs of this particular sports shoe were manufactured and sold throughout the United States. 5 of them went to Arizona, and only 1 went to Los Angeles, and that's the size 45. It was a breakthrough that the police had been waiting for a long time. The killer had no idea that the officers had made such an important discovery. Sure that nothing threatened him, he went on a new hunt. He arrived in the Sierra Madre, where the Bennett house was located. The couple had 2 children, Whitney, 16, and James, 18. That evening, the family organized a small party for Independence Day. The daughter was at her friend's house at the time. She came home in the middle of the night when her parents were already asleep. A moment later, she went to bed herself. While she was lying in a deep sleep unconsciously, an intruder entered her bedroom. He had an iron tire spoon in his hand. He approached the girl, covered her mouth with his hand, and struck her in the head with all his strength. The girl immediately lost consciousness. The assailant was struck hit by hit. After a moment, he decided he would the victim, but he would kill her first. He grabbed the cable from the phone and started wrapping it around the girl's neck. But then there were sparks from the wire. At first, the man thought that a soul was leaking out of the teenager's body, and hence this blue light. Frightened, he quickly left the victim, and Whitney took a deep breath at the same moment. The killer panicked. The desire to kill the girl quickly passed, so he jumped out the window and ran away. He later revealed that he was convinced that the light that appeared over the telephone cable was a sign to him that Christ himself was protecting the girl and that he and Satan were defeated. The teenager somehow miraculously disconnected herself and stumbled into her bedroom. She turned to her parents' room, but she fainted a moment later. She was admitted to the hospital, where she had 478 stitches. Her skull was almost crushed. The perpetrator hit her at least 20 times. The cops were hoping that Whitney saw the assailant, but the girl had no idea what had happened. She only confessed that she woke up with a severe headache. For this, traces of Avia's shoes were found in her house. On July 7th, the killer appeared again in Monterey Park, where he killed the DOI. He stopped a stolen car at the house of 61-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson. While he was walking around the building, he noticed a folded window, so he treated it as an invitation to come in, which he was happy to take advantage of. When he got there, he saw Joyce sleeping on the couch. He approached her and put a gun on her head. The woman started screaming, and the assailant, in response, brutally kicked her. He was driven by such aggression that he left a footprint on the victim's face. Joyce didn't survive the attack. The killer didn't satisfy his satisfaction. Taking a woman's life was too easy for him. So about 3 o'clock in the morning he parked near Sophie Dickman's house. The 63-year-old lived alone. He went inside and woke the woman. He put a scarf on her head, and he began to search the house himself. When he found nothing, he returned to Sophie and asked her where she had hidden the money or other precious things. At first, the victim claimed that she had no valuables, but eventually revealed she had a small box in the bathroom. The assailant dragged her there and after a moment found what he was looking for. He took Sophie back to the bedroom and her there. He left her tied to the bed, and after a moment he disappeared into the darkness. The woman was helped by a neighbor who heard her screams. As it turned out, she was a cop. She called Gila Carrillo. She was convinced that behind the attack on Sophie was the perpetrator whom the officer was looking for. The detective was on the spot after a while. He looked around inside and saw the chaos he had already known. which left the murderer in every house he appeared in after darkness. Other elements also agreed. The phone was disconnected, the woman was caught in chains, and the precious things also disappeared. Sophie's testimony proved valuable. She mentioned a tall, skinny brunette with dark eyes. He was dressed in dark, but the most important detail was the smell that struck him. As the woman noticed, he had broken teeth and a terrible breath. Brutal attacks and murders have reached the media. These perpetrators screamed as intruders from the valley. It's been speculated who might be the attacker. The chance to reverse the course of events came shortly thereafter. In one of the abandoned cars, which was identified as the vehicle belonging to the killer, a visiting card from the dentist's office was found. The investigators suspected that the small card belonged to the intruder, given the condition of his tooth, which witnesses mentioned. So the police found the dentist, who was probably the killer. This one admitted that he was treating some Richard Ramirez, who suffered from a painful puffiness and would soon have to come back to the office. The detectives decided to put a trap on him. They put an alarm under the doctor's desk, which was supposed to be triggered as soon as a suspect entered the office. But this seemingly perfect plan didn't work out. Richard did appear on the spot, but the alarm button didn't work. This incident made the killer still free and could continue to attack innocent people without any problems. On July 20th, he reached Glendale. Walking past the green streets, he saw the house of Maxon and Leela Nadings. They were 68 and 66 years old. Armed with a machete, the intruder entered their house. He immediately headed to the bedroom where the couple slept. He kicked into bed to wake her. When the woman started screaming, he picked up the blade and stabbed it into Max's neck. To his disappointment, he noticed that the man did not die immediately. He also had a problem hitting Leela, so he dropped the machete and grabbed the gun. He killed a man first, then a woman, then the killer again grabbed the blade and mutilated the victims' bodies. After he murdered the marriage, the assailant broke into the next house. There lived China Rong and Somkit Covenant, a marriage of immigrants from Thailand. They had 2 children, an 8-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter. The killer went inside without any trouble. Somkit slept in the living room on the couch. She couldn't even scream because the intruder covered her mouth with a hand. After a moment, he walked into her husband's bedroom and shot him in the head. The man died on the spot. Then the killer came back to the woman and dragged her into the bathroom. There, he grabbed the dryer, cut the cable, tied the victim's hands, and took her to the bedroom, where he brutally her next to her husband's body. In all, he used Somkit 3 times that night. He robbed the house and left, and the woman took the children and ran to the neighbors to ask for help. The killer got a new nickname in the media. He was called the Night Persecutor. He himself followed with interest everything that appeared in the press about him. He was pleased that he was provoking panic among the public, while at the same time making sure that the police had no idea who he was. It gave him confidence. He pretended that he was being watched by Satan, and it was thanks to him that the officers still didn't stone him. Evil. Interestingly, the killer spent some time at the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. This object still has a fatal reputation, all because of the stormy events that threw a shadow on the guest house. There have been many suicides and unexplained deaths there. In addition, the main visitors were usually middle-wealthy people who did not abstain from alcohol and drugs. The most famous case related to this hotel dates back to 2013 when the room was rented by Eliza Land. The woman disappeared, and the only trace of her was a strange video from the hotel elevator. You can see the Canadian pressing a few buttons at once, moving her hands as if she was driving someone away, and hiding in the corner. The video went online, and the internet users started their own investigation. They were sure the girl was hiding from the attacker. After some time, Elisa's naked body was found in one of the water tanks on the roof of the building. We still don't know how she got there. One of the most likely versions assumes she went inside herself. She was known to be suffering from an extreme form of bipolar affective disorder, and several packets of drugs were found in her room. The night hunter spent a few weeks at the Cecil Hotel. The next target of the psychopath was the Peterson family. Virginia, Chris, and their 5-year-old daughter lived in a modest but very well-maintained house. In the middle of the night, their peace was disturbed by a robber. His presence awoke Virginia, but before she could react, the killer shot her in the face. Chris broke his legs, but then a bullet swept through his skull, and yet the man was still alive. He heard the cry of his daughter, and immediately got up and threw himself at the intruder. He tried to turn his neck, but the attacker managed to free him and escape. How did it happen that the marriage didn't die despite such serious injuries? As it turned out, the gun with which the pursuer fired had expired ammunition and the dust did not work as it should. So Chris's skull was not pierced, and the bullet that hit Virginia hit the skyscraper and flew through his neck, bypassing the brain. On August 8th, the perpetrator broke into the house at Diamond Bar, where Sakina and Elias Abode lived. The couple had 2 little sons. One was 3 years old, the other just 9 weeks old. The killer shot their father, and the mother was beaten and he tortured her in every way. He was digging, hitting with his fists, scratching, raping again, and even pressing her breasts to get milk out of them. Finally, when he was satisfied, he abandoned the woman and ran away with another prey. 10 days later, the persecutor unexpectedly changed the area of his activity. He went to San Francisco. He broke into Peter and Barbara's house. He shot them both. On leaving, he wrote a cube knife on the wall, which was supposed to be a reference to the London serial killer of the Cube trial. The police got in touch with the mayor of San Francisco. They wanted a woman to set a reward for helping to catch the perpetrator. Dianne Feinstein organized a press conference where she dismissed everything the investigators have achieved so far. She revealed to the media the details and the evidence that the officers had gathered. Worst of all, she also told me about the shoe prints she found. This discovery has been kept strictly secret until now because if the killer found out that he was leaving traces that would help attribute murders to him, he would immediately get rid of his shoes. And the cops were right because since then no more footprints of Avia's shoes have been found at the crime scene. The killer felt it was getting hotter and hotter around him. A prize was awarded to him, and articles about the night chaser were screaming from every shop site. They were decorated with great memorial portraits. The whole of Los Angeles tried to catch the killer, and he already knew that contrary to what he thought before, the police had evidence in his case. On August 24th, he stole an orange Toyota Combi and drove it to Mission Viejo. That was the beginning of the end of a bloody series of nighttime persecutors. 13-year-old James Romero noticed a moving vehicle. In spite of the dark, he fixed the scooter and drew attention to the car passing by because its driver looked at the nearby houses with a frightening gaze. The persecutor went further in search of another possession that he could rob. He got to Bill Carnes, who lived with his fiancée, Carol Smith. He shot the man and told the woman to confess love to Satan. He then The killer, leaving her house, passed by near Romero. The boy looked at him carefully, then ran home and woke up his parents. The persecutor was always careful not to leave any fingerprints, but after attacking Bill and Carol, his hands sweated tremendously. So he took off his gloves, sat in the car, and left. He dropped the car a bit further, before worshipping it, but he forgot that he also touched the mirror on which he left his mark. Meanwhile, the daughter of Jesse Perez appeared to his detective Danoff. She said her father knew about the night hunt, but he was worried about his life. She admitted that the men met at the bus station and the new friend was named Rick. From her description emerged almost the same assailant as the witnesses were talking about. Broken teeth, constant talk about Satan, and he boasted he was a perfect thief. The detective came to Frank Salerno and told him everything he heard. He told the 2 officers to go to the girl and talk to her. Then Perez came in. After brief protests, he finally began to speak. He admitted that he met Rick through his brother. He also bought a caliber .20 gun from him. Already at the police station, he confirmed that the man in the drawings is Rick, whom he knows. The police determined that the stolen items were sold to a passenger, Felipe Solano. So they went to him, and there they saw that the man had objects that disappeared from the crime scene. Unfortunately, apart from finding these things, Felipe did not have any valuable information about the perpetrator himself. He didn't know his name or where he lived. Meanwhile, the 13-year-old Romero described quite in detail the man who was spinning around his house. More importantly, he remembered what kind of car he was driving, and even partially recreated the registration numbers. All this information was published in the media in the hope that someone had seen the car. Then a man came to the police, who claimed that his friend had stolen a car like this. The car was found. The persecutor left them at the mall, rapidly assembled the vehicle to the lab, and their breakthrough. A clear fingerprint was found on the mirror. But that's not the end. Analyzing the network of connections between the clients who purchased things belonging to the murderer's victims, the investigators reached out to Armand Rodriguez. He had a friend of his, Rick, who was a thief and often sold jewelry. Although he initially refused to cooperate, he finally revealed the name of a friend, Ramirez. Everything went so fast. With a fingerprint, they hit Richard Ramirez at the base, who had already been on the account for the burglary, as well as drug trafficking. Everything began to work together as a coherent whole. The investigators had no doubt that Ramirez was a night hunt, so it was decided to publish his image. The murderer's picture appeared in almost every newspaper. It was on TV, too. Everywhere you could see a photograph of a man with black Hazcoal eyes. On August 30th, 1985, Richard was returning from Tucson, Arizona. His brother lived there. He had no idea that all of Los Angeles already knew that he was responsible for the brutal murders. When he got there, he got off the bus and went to the store. He wanted to buy a pan and coffee. It was only there that it began to reach him what was actually happening. When he was shopping, he noticed that a group of women were watching him. They whispered to each other, pointing to him with their fingers. He picked up a word, killer. He looked at the newspapers on the shelf with an angle of eye, and saw his picture on the main Spanish language page, La Opinion. With horror, he panicked. He quickly ran out of the store, and after only a dozen steps he noticed the radio cars running towards him. Ramirez sneaked in front of him, ignoring the other cars. He tried to pull a woman out of one of the vehicles, but her screams were heard by people in the store and the hair salon. They ran outside and recognized the night hunt. They followed him. Every minute, more people joined the pursuit. When he tried to steal the car, a man ran to him and hit him in the head with a metal tube. Richard hasn't lost his balance. He ran on, albeit bleeding and exhausted. Finally, he got another blow, which this time overthrew him. A police car arrived at the last minute. If he hadn't arrived at the right time, the crowd would probably have scratched Ramirez with their own hands. The officer, not without problems, separated the people from the night pursuers and asked, "What is your name?" Then the man replied, "Ricardo Ramirez." The cop already knew that the most wanted man in Los Angeles was in front of him, and the county's nightmare had just come to an end. The police found Ramirez's gun, and Carlo and Solano arrived at the police station where he was. He replied briefly to each of their questions, "I want a lawyer." So Jill knew she had to find a way to get to the killer. He started talking to him in Spanish. Ramirez recovered immediately. Carlo spoke later. We started talking to him. We were talking, Richard was talking, but in the third person. He kept saying, "The night chaser did this, the night chaperone did that, the chaser, the persecutor, the perpetrator." When I started talking to him, I did it as if I was just talking to a man on the street. I asked him, "Why do you think the night pursuers let Maria Hernandez go?" And it turned out that she resembled my sister Ruth. She looked strikingly similar to her. So I started talking about her, about his dad. I asked if his father abused his daughter. He got angry, lay down on the table, and gave the impression that he had hyperventilation. His arms began to rise. He was really angry, and for a millisecond, for a million second, I said to myself, if this guy gets up and starts flying around the room, I'll get out of here. I can fight a man, but I can't fight the devil." Later, the conversation shifted to Satanism. Ramirez directly admitted that he believes in the devil and his life is centered around this relationship. He began to talk about his childhood and the religiousness of his parents. He also revealed that his father was impulsive and aggressive. Sometimes he felt like he was about to cry out. However, he did not want to talk about his crimes. When the subject went down to murder, he demanded a lawyer. But Richard didn't have a chance to defend himself. All the evidence gathered testified against him. There was no doubt that he was the night chaser. His family was in shock. It is true that Ramirez has long walked his own paths, but no one suspected him of sadism and murder. His father said, "I accepted that he was a thief, but never that he did the things I'm talking about. The media turned him into a monster, and he's actually just a poor boy who was raised with faith in God. Our grandchildren suffer this badly. They're very sad. They were used to Uncle Richie. He took care of them and brought them toys. Today, it is hard to imagine Ramirez as a caring uncle." On September 5th, Richard was taken to the show. Witnesses were supposed to judge from behind the windows if it was him they saw at the crime scene. Because of his head wounds, his hair was partially shaved. Nevertheless, the victims had no doubts. It was Ramirez who was a night chaser. The prosecutor's office could have been preparing for the trial. A total of 50 charges have been filed against Richard. The evidence collected was extremely strong, but Ramirez had the impression that it was all going on somewhere outside of him. When the trial started, he provoked his hand, showing the world a pentagram. He wore black glasses for the trial, which he didn't take off even when the judge spoke directly to him. The trial was attended not only by the families of the victims, but also by mysterious women dressed in black. Soon it turned out that they were Ramirez's fans. They accompanied him all the time, smiled at him, wrote letters, and some even showed pentagrams in solidarity with the killer. When journalists asked them what drew them to persecution, some replied, "Everybody says he's so bad, but I know he is nice. I met him. He's suspected of 14 murders, I know, but he's really a nice guest." In the courtroom, the most impressive was the testimony of the victims. They described exactly their encounter with Ramirez, as well as the extent of the injuries he inflicted on them. A lot of tears were poured out, and the pain of the victims was felt by almost everyone. The defenders tried to prove that most witnesses associated Richard's face with newspapers and media reports, so they pointed to him. But all the people interviewed had no doubts. Richard Ramirez was behind the brutal attacks. During the trial, the night pursuer established a strong bond with Doreen Lloyd. The woman showed up at every trial and didn't take a look at the killer. She sent him 75 letters. She was his total opposite. Cultural, friendly, calm, and educated, she defended him in the media, and when asked if she was disturbed by the crimes he committed, she only replied, "It doesn't matter." After hearing all the witnesses and analyzing the evidence, Richard was left to wait for a verdict. He was in a Los Angeles County prison. The reverse fate wanted actor Sean Penn to go to the same resort in 1989. He brutally beat a photographer and was supposed to spend a month behind bars. Richard, delighted at the prospect of staying in the same establishment as the Hollywood star, wrote a short letter to him. He asked for an autograph. In response, Penn wrote, "Dear Richard, you can't sit in jail and not feel an affinity with the comrades of Nidola. But it looks like I've done the impossible. I don't feel any affinity with you." In this brief letter, Ramirez only replied that he wanted to stay in touch with him and continue to let them know. He also put the number 666 on the 20th of September 1989. The jury passed its decision. Richard Ramirez was found guilty of 46 charges. There was still a penalty. The prosecutor demanded execution. On November 9th, the court accepted the request and sentenced Richard to death. He also allowed Ramirez himself to speak. His speech has already been recorded in criminal history. I don't have to look beyond the walls of this room to see all the liars, haters, murderers, robbers, and paranoid cowards. The real wisdom of this world, I want to scratch when I look at you. It's messy, hypocrites about one thing. You're all superfluous when it comes to something. No one knows this better than those who kill in the name of politics. Openly or secretly, that is, the governments of this world who murder in the name of God and the fatherland. I don't have to listen to your social rationalization. I've heard it all before. Legions of Night, Night Tribe. Do not repeat the mistakes of the nightly persecutor, and do not show mercy to anyone. Ramirez was sentenced to 19 death sentences. He was supposed to die in the gas chamber. This decision did not really impress him. He just threw, "It's a big deal for me, see you at Disneyland." In 1996, Ramirez shocked the public once again. For he stood on the wedding cover. His wife became Doreen. She declared to the world, "I just wanted to say that I'm incredibly happy and very, very proud to have married Richard and become his wife." But there's no happy end in this romantic story. Doreen, although she had already lived as Mrs. Ramirez, did not stay with her husband until her death. She left when reports of Richard's first victim appeared in 2009. It was supposed to be Mei Lang, a 9-year-old whom he killed before he went hunting as a night hunter. The murder took place on April 10, 1984. The girl died in the basement of a building she lived in. Her partially naked body, hanging under the pipe, was found by her brother. DNA tests have linked this crime to Ramirez. The persecutor hasn't been sentenced. Repeated appeals prolonged his stay in the death cell, but the execution turned out to be not a gas chamber, but a cancer. Richard died on June 7, 2013. He was previously diagnosed with lymphoma. Because of drugs and hepatitis C, he also had problems with this organ. He died at the age of 53. In an interview with Inside Edition magazine, he admitted directly, "We're all bad, one way or another, isn't it? Yeah, I'm angry. Not 100%, but I'm angry. Evil has always existed. It's the perfect world that people are looking for, and it'll only get worse. We have to learn that often our worst qualities are our best." But where exactly did this evil come from in Richard himself? To understand this, we have to go back to his childhood. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He had a sibling, 3 brothers, and also a sister. The family was distinguished by an aggressive father, who was punished for disobedience, among others, with a garden snake. The man went crazy, hurting not only his children but himself, punching his head against the wall. The brothers were afraid of these explosions, although unfortunately they could not be avoided. In 1962, when Richard was 2 years old, there was a serious accident involving him. He was then taken care of by a nanny, whom his parents hired. The boy from birth showed a great interest in music. That day, he wanted to turn on the radio on his own, which was in the drawer. So he decided to climb the furniture and reach the device. But as he took the next steps, the chamber began to bend, until it finally fell hard, hitting the baby's head. Richard lost consciousness. He was quickly taken to the hospital, where he was put in 30 stitches. He miraculously survived. He started having seizures at school. He had 20 of them in a month. It was not until years later that it was discovered that Ramirez had chronic epilepsy. He lost his place in the football team because of his attacks. It was a big blow for him because he loved the sport and was really good at it. His cousin Miguel played a major role in the life of the young Richard. He had just returned from Vietnam and proudly presented his war medals. The boy looked at him with indiscriminate admiration, especially when his cousin introduced him to the secrets of distant missions. Miguel told him about everything, showing his photographs as proof. He perpetuated the Vietnamese women on them. He forced women to have sex, threatening them with guns. In one of the pictures, he was holding a human head cut off. Richard was looking at it all and he was absorbing the message like a sponge. On May 4th, 1973, Ramirez visited his cousin. When they were playing mini billiards together, Miguel's wife came back. There was a quarrel between the couple, and the man after a moment went to the fridge, where he had a hidden gun and shot the woman straight in the face from a close distance. Richard looked at it all in silence. He was in shock. His cousin forbade him to admit that he had seen anything. The murder he saw completely changed his life. From a smiling and warm boy, he became a serious and dark teenager. He also started taking drugs and stealing. Although he previously had good grades and was a favorite of teachers, he became a rebel, whose science was no longer interested at all. He eventually left his home in El Paso and moved to Los Angeles. He was out of control. The ocean made a huge impression on him, but even bigger, the sight of beautiful young women in bikinis. They parade around the beach showcasing graceful figures. Richard couldn't take his eyes off them. When he saw prostitutes for the first time, he began to fantasize about sex, violence, and enslavement. His darkness was deepened by his drug experiments, which he began at the age of 14. He was getting more and more interested in LSD, but also hallucinogenic mushrooms. Then his fascination with Satan began to appear. Although he came from an ultra-Catholic family, the devil did not cause fear in him. Evil attracted him, and drugs enhanced the visions in which Satan appeared. It is in him that Richard begins to see his confidant, someone who will always be with him and will not condemn him for his thoughts and fantasies. This is pure wisdom, as opposed to hypocrisy and constant deception. It's the power of carelessness. Satanism comes from evil. Ramirez, seeing no point in further education, dropped out of school and started working in an international hotel chain. He was mostly cleaning and carrying luggage behind the guests. The hotel was like Disneyland to him. He saw young women passing by in the hallway. They caused a lot of excitement in him. He masturbated afterward, imagining that he was bound to them, and they were completely surrendered to his grace. Eventually, he turned his fantasies into action. He watched an attractive brunette enter the room by herself. He miraculously survived. He started having seizures at school. He had 20 of them in a month. It was not until years later that it was discovered that Ramirez had chronic epilepsy. He lost his place in the football team because of his attacks. It was a big blow for him because he loved the sport and was really good at it. His cousin Miguel played a major role in the life of the young Richard. He had just returned from Vietnam and proudly presented his war medals. The boy looked at him with indiscriminate admiration, especially when his cousin introduced him to the secrets of distant missions. Miguel told him about everything, showing his photographs as proof. He perpetuated the Vietnamese women on them. He forced women to have sex, threatening them with guns. In one of the pictures, he was holding a human head cut off. Richard was looking at it all and he was absorbing the message like a sponge. On May 4th, 1973, Ramirez visited his cousin. When they were playing many billiards together, Miguel's wife came back. There was a quarrel between the couple, and the man after a moment went to the fridge, where he had a hidden gun and shot the woman straight in the face from a close distance. Richard looked at it all in silence. He was in shock. His cousin forbade him to admit that he had seen anything. The murder he saw completely changed his life. From a smiling and warm boy, he became a serious and dark teenager. He also started taking drugs and stealing. Although he previously had good grades and was a favorite of teachers, he became a rebel, whose science was no longer interested at all. He eventually left his home in El Paso and moved to Los Angeles. He was out of control. The ocean made a huge impression on him, but even bigger, the sight of beautiful young women in bikinis. They parade around the beach showcasing graceful figures. Richard couldn't take his eyes off them. When he saw prostitutes for the first time, he began to fantasize about sex, violence, and enslavement. His darkness was deepened by his drug experiments, which he began at the age of 14. He was getting more and more interested in LSD, but also hallucinogenic mushrooms. Then his fascination with Satan began to appear. Although he came from an ultra-Catholic family, the devil did not cause fear in him. Evil attracted him, and drugs enhanced the visions in which Satan appeared. It is in him that Richard begins to see his confidant, someone who will always be with him and will not condemn him for his thoughts and fantasies. This is pure wisdom, as opposed to hypocrisy and constant deception. It's power without charity. Satanism comes from evil. Ramirez, seeing no point in further education, dropped out of school and started working in an international hotel chain. He was mostly cleaning and carrying luggage behind the guests. The hotel was like Disneyland to him. He saw young women passing by in the hallway. They caused a lot of excitement in him. He masturbated afterward, imagining that he was bound to them, and they were completely surrendered to his grace. Eventually, he turned his fantasies into action. He watched an attractive brunette enter the room by herself. When she disappeared into the bathroom, Richard quietly opened the door and slipped inside. He hid himself in the closet, waiting for the victim to be within his reach. When he saw her, he jumped out of hiding, covered her mouth, fell on the ground, and bound her. Excited, he began to take off her pants, but when he was going to, a woman's husband entered the room. He was furious. He quickly threw himself on the boy and began to cover him with no remorse all over his body. Ramirez lost consciousness. The hotel service and the police were called, and Richard was taken to the hospital. Nevertheless, the couple eventually withdrew the charges, and the case against the boy was dismissed. After some time, he moved permanently to Los Angeles. There he was mainly engaged in house robbery. His fascination with Satan became so great that he decided to travel to San Francisco to speak personally with Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan and the author of the Bible of Satan. The high priest, after years, recalled this meeting. When I met Richard Ramirez, he seemed to me to be the sweetest, most polite young man you'd ever want to meet on your way. He stopped me on the street and said, "Sorry, Mr. LaVey, can I talk to you for a minute?" Well, I generally don't like when people treat me this way, so I'm over it. I don't do business on the sidewalk. You can write a letter and send it by mail. He turned back and apologized for holding on to me. He said he wanted to ask only a few things, but he saw I was busy, so he wished me all the best and a good sunset night. He went off the street with his Texas friend, as I thought. I watched him go away and I almost called him to come back and talk to me. Today, when I think about it, I feel very bad. Richard wasn't upset by Anton's cold enough treatment. He returned to Los Angeles and began to explore his literature even further. He anticipated the black, abandoned the smile, and decided that he would seriously begin to implement Satanist philosophy. Later, he turned her into terror, which he unleashed as a night pursuit. One of the most terrifying serial killers in history. Richard Ramirez saw the world as a place full of corruption and unhealthy relationships. He admitted that serial killers do on a small scale what governments do on a big scale. They are the products of our time, and we live in very bloody times. Even psychopaths have deeply hidden emotions, or maybe they don't. According to him, it was all about violence. People have been brainwashed, they are programmed like computers, and they're just puppies. This country was created by violence, and what was created in this way often ends in violence. Shaming, as a rule, is a very individual matter. But when we have a group of such people, their shameless becomes a rule and a law. Killing is killing. It doesn't matter if it's done for religious obligation or for fun. People have killed themselves to create the kind of democracy we have. Richard Ramirez killed 14 people. He was convinced to the end that it was Satan who provided balance in his life and was the purpose of his existence.